morning. The next morning, many frame building attempts later, even more boat building attempts later, 1 day later, one humongous meal later, a little while later, later that night, one entree later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, several bouquets later, 10 hours later, 80 minutes later, many memories later, 1 week later, happy friendiversary.
Later.
Later, many unbearable moments later. The next morning, many adorable hours later, several days later, much later, 1 week later, one beautiful Christmas morning later, many versions later, 1 week later, many meeps later, many plays later, many superstitions later, 2,000-ish years later,
Many buckets later.
14 hours later, days later. Meanwhile, many repressed memories later. The next morning, 1 nap later. 24 sleepless hours later. Several days later. 1 journey through space later. Much tranquility later. Many invitations later. 6 to 8 weeks later, 2 weeks later, 1 hour later, many hours later, a few moments later, 800 kajillion potatoes later, several hard-hitting hours later, the next day,
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier.
a while later, many miles later, the next day, 1 week later, 1 bus ride later, the next morning, many exam questions later. The next morning, many hours later, 2 minutes later, several hours later, several thousand ripped pants later, 1 hour later, several months later, 200 whoopsies later, 6 stinky months later, several weeks later, later that night, abracalater.